Here. Thank you. Thanks, Craig. So I only met Rabbi Kronish one time before his stroke. So the 12 years that I knew him from after I interviewed and came here, he had been incapacitated, as you remember, had difficulty walking, difficulty talking. The one time I met him, funny enough, was at a CCAR rabbinic convention in the men's room. He was finishing and I was coming in. And I knew who he was because I had seen him from a distance and because I was in Worcester, Massachusetts, and his son, Ron, Rabbi Ron Kronish, who is 1 year older than me, our daughters, Sarah and his daughter, Dahlia, were born within a day, I think, of each other in a hospital in Worcester, and we knew each other as colleagues. Ron was studying for his PhD, but he was working at the Hebrew High School in Worcester, and I had a small congregation there. And so I mentioned to Rabbi Kronish how I knew his granddaughter and his grandchildren and his son. And that's all I remember about the conversation. He went out, I stayed in and then I didn't see him during the rest of the conference. The rest of my time with him, it was just kind of this fateful thing that he had that stroke, and then I ended up coming here and being in his congregation. But it also meant I continued my relationship with his family and still have over all these years, still in contact with Rabbi Ron Kronish, his daughter, Rabbi Dahlia Kronish, who was ordained at JTS and is in New York at the Heschel School. And I've been to at least two of their daughters' weddings. So, and obviously I knew Lillian during the years that she was here at Temple, since she outlived him. I thought we'd spend just a few minutes if each of you might share a memory of Rabbi Kronish, something you remember. Dennis began by saying that he remembered. What did you remember? He opened every sermon, Dennis, with what?
My dear friends.
My dear friends.
Oh, wow.
And Norma was remembering about his blessing at the end, right, Norma?
Right. Yes.
He did that even after he had his stroke, though it was very difficult for him, and he more or less the words were like mumbled. I don't know how many of you remember in those days when he continued to kind of limp slowly to the center of the bima and raise his arms and say the priestly benediction at the end of services. That was for a while. He did that for quite a while. Anybody else want to share a memory?
I came here in 1983, which was a year before he got sick. And I remember my then husband and I walked in to meet him and introduce ourselves. And he was just such an impressive figure. It's all I remember. He was tall and very handsome, and just a real presence in the room. You could actually feel it when you sat, which was very unusual for us.
Nice, very nice. Gail, you got, Stanley, what you got?
I didn't know him well, but I remember him as being a very warm person. I remember him being wheeled out. This is later on, many years later, just in his wheelchair and just very friendly, just lovely.
Nice.
But I remember hearing much about him over those years because I was then at Temple Emmanuel.
Right.
So
the Whartons.
Yes. My father was actually on the search committee that brought Rabbi Kronish to the temple. And I remember being really afraid of him and Mr. Sidney Greenberg, who ran the Sunday school. I was just a little girl. And he would put his hands up. He was so big in that big white robe. And he was like God standing up front. He was
Right.
so big and impressive. And if anyone in the congregation talked while he was speaking, he would just stop. And everybody knew that whoever was speaking had to be quiet. It
Yeah,
was wonderful. Yeah.
thank you. And Judge Crystal, do you want to share anything?
I'm afraid my memory is not that good.
Okay. So what we're going to do now, I'm going to take us through the notion of how did the title rabbi even come into being? And we're going to talk a little about that and talk about what the rabbi was when the rabbi title came into being and how it evolved into what it became and what it is, and how it's still evolving. And I would suggest, if we think about titles, just think about, I think as a child and growing up, and even in college, there are corporate titles that did not exist that do now. The whole idea of a CEO and a COO and a CFO and a CTO and a CIO and a CMO, these are titles that are used now in corporations that never existed before, right? There was the president of the corporation or a director of a corporation, but even in our lifetimes, we've seen the evolution of titles. And if you think religiously, we know in the Catholic Church, there's the Pope, then there's cardinals, then there's archbishops and bishops, right? We know the hierarchy because we've lived among Catholics and been around them for our lives. But if you look at the Eastern Orthodox, they have a different set of names. They start with the patriarch, right? So their leader is not the Pope, their leader is the patriarch. And they have names like the Metropolitan. I mean, they have other titles that are not within the Catholic, even though Eastern Orthodox and Catholicism grow out of the same roots and in the same areas of the world. They evolve titles differently. So I want to start with two little jokes just to set up this beginning. The first one, actually, the mothers are bragging about their grown sons. One, my son is the head of he's a doctor and he's the head of his department in Mount Sinai Hospital. And the other one is, my son is the managing partner of a great law firm. And the other one says, my son is the rabbi of a great synagogue. And someone says, Rabbi, what kind of job is that for a Jewish boy?
Oh.
Now, it's an old joke, but I want to tell you, it was my grandmother's reaction when I said that I was going to rabbinical school. My grandmother was born in Europe and in Eastern Europe and came to America. Her knowledge of rabbis is they lived by the graces of the community. They got paid in chickens and whatever people, they lived a poor life. They were always beaten down by the synagogue and it was always a difficult life. And she didn't want her grandson to have that kind of a life. For her, that was the rabbi, right? Because of the world she grew up in. She didn't know of the modern rabbi. She didn't know of the modern synagogue. She had no idea of the notion of it being a profession. For her, it was kind of what you did when you couldn't do other things. It was kind of what you did to make a living. And there's the other joke has to do with the little young boy who's bragging. They're bragging about their fathers. It's the same, but it's from a different standpoint. Hi, Bobby. The children are bragging, and each one of them is bragging about what their father is. And one of them says, my father is a rabbi and he owns hell. The kid said, what do you mean he owns hell? And the kid said, well, my mom came home and said, last night, the temple board just gave him hell. I know it's a stupid joke, but
Cute.
it sets up the opening that I want to share with you. This is from an essay in a website of modern Orthodox thinkers who are scholars of Bible and rabbinics. And this happens to be about why we call Moses Rabbeinu, why the rabbis called Moshe Rabbeinu. Her name is Malka Simkovich. She's a doctor, professor. This is from an essay that she wrote about not just Moses, but others. But it's good that Bobby came on because now Bobby can be our first reader. So she likes to read.
Thank you. My pleasure. Okay. By calling Moses Moshe Rabbeinu, the rabbis refer to Moses as the ultimate religious leader, while at the same time they subjugate him and the unique position that he has held as the first and greatest leader of the Jewish people to the rabbinic agenda.
So wait, Bobby. So look at that. And so it says that they made him the ultimate religious leader because for the rabbis, the title Rabbeinu, rabbi, was that. But at the same time, they lowered him. Because if you think of who Moshe really was, he wasn't the head of a congregation. He wasn't subject to boards that could give him hell. He had a direct relationship with God. But the rabbis brought him down to their level by calling him Moshe Rabbeinu. They made him like one of them. That's what she's saying. And I think she's right. They were reframing the great Moses, the great lawgiver, as a rabbi, just a rabbi, like they were rabbis. So a religious leader, but not Moses the great, Moses the rabbi. Okay, Bobby, continue, please.
Okay. By calling Moses a rabbi, the rabbis authenticate themselves as direct descendants of the most prominent leader in Israelite history.
So, Bobby, what did they do in that sentence? They now connected themselves to him. So just as they had made him one of them, the rabbis became like Moses, the great lawgiver. So in that act of calling him Moshe Rabbeinu, of giving him that label, which is used throughout rabbinic literature, the Mishnah, the Talmud, by doing that, they have done something really important. They have made him both less than he was and made themselves greater than they were. Right? They made the connection from Moses to them, even though that we're talking about at least 1,200 years to 1,300 or 1,400 years in time. They made that leap. Okay, Bobby, you want to continue?
Sure. There may be an additional reason for this epithet. Despite the enormous position of respect Moses holds in the Torah, he is one of the most embattled figures in all of the Tanakh. During his tenure as leader of the Israelites, he was poorly treated much of the time by the Jews, who often undermined his authority or ignored him altogether. The Israelite treatment of Moses must have been a bit of an embarrassment to pious Jews in the ancient world. By calling him our rabbi, the sages finally gave him the proper respect that he never was given by the Israelites in his own lifetime. For the sages, calling someone a rabbi, even though the title did not exist during this person's lifetime, is a high honor.
Okay. So, Roger came on, Alice came on, nice, Violet. Thank you. There you are. So what do you think about what she's saying about Moses, about the notion of Moshe Rabbeinu? How do you react to that? Anybody have anything they want to say?
I
Yes,
wonder whether the word Rabbeinu also has a very familiar touch. Rabbeinu, I mean, the Beinu, does it?
Yes, means our. It's like Avinu Malkeinu, our. So yes, he's one of us. He's one of unser, right? I mean, he's part of us. Yet it is, I mean, it is a warm ending.
An affectionate, there's an affectionate tone to it, I think.
Yes, it has that. I think it has that connotation. Roger?
I'm thinking that he's not the kind of rabbi that I would think would be a member of a community for a long time. I mean, you have to get tenure, you have to get along with the board of directors. He certainly had a problem. I mean, getting along with everybody, and at the end, the president of the congregation said, "You know what? You're really not good enough to move to the new shul that we're building. So that's it. Goodbye."
Yeah. You know, that comment could be made about all of the prophets of the Tanakh. You know, they're not people you'd want to sit down to a friendly dinner. You know, that's not their role. Their role isn't to be nice companions. And Moses as well, his role is to push through this people, you know, get them to freedom and get them through the desert. And it's a tough people. And he's got he has a sense of anger, frustration. He yells at them, he condemns them, he defends them. But he's not necessarily, as you are pointing out, someone that you would just have a schmooze with. You know, you wouldn't go have a beer with Moses. With Aaron, you might. You know, you might go and just go to have a beer, have a drink, have coffee, but not with Moses. You know, and not with Isaiah or Jeremiah, not with any of them. You wouldn't want to do it. They're a very different breed of human being. Any other comments? Okay, so let me go back to our text, because we're going to now start to look at we'll take a look at an old encyclopedia that used to be the only one until in Israel they produced another one. But this one was put together by a lot of really important scholars at the beginning of the 20th century. And they used the Hebrew title here, and they tried to talk through how did this whole thing develop. Because there's a lot of names here, let me take us through a little bit of this, and I'll just take us through to get to where we are. So the Hebrew term used as a title for those who are distinguished for learning, who are the authoritative teachers of the law and who are appointed spiritual heads of the community. It's derived from the noun, which in biblical Hebrew means great or distinguished, and in post-biblical Hebrew, master, as opposed to slave or pupil. In the Palestinian schools, that is in the area of Judea or Israel, the sages were addressed as rabbi, rabbi. This term of respectful address gradually came to be used as a title, the pronominal suspect I, my, losing its significance with the frequent use of the term. So now, this is a quote from later. When we're talking about the Aruch, this is much later, but it's written in this way. It's a letter that comes from Sharir Gaon, who is in the 9th century of the Common Era. And it talks about the title in Babylonia. Rav was the title used in Babylonia. Rabbi was the title used in Israel. All right? It was the same title, but it differentiated where they were. So before this title came into being, about the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, they didn't have titles. So that's why we have people like Shimon HaTzadik, Simon the Just, Antigonus of Socho, Yossi ben Yochanan. None of them have the title rabbi. Later, in the 2nd century, we have Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yossi, right? But we also have the title Mar, which today means Mr. Mar. like Mr., like we would use it in English. Mar Ukba, those titles are there. And then there's the title Rabban. That was the head of the Sanhedrin. That was the rabbi who was the head rabbi, was called Rabban. Okay, so I want to go through all of that. Now, here. Okay, so any questions about how the title evolved? So we don't even have it before about the year 200, somewhere in the late 100s to the early 200s of the Common Era. Before that, we don't have the title rabbi. Hillel is not called rabbi, right? Hillel's just called Hillel.
Right.
Even though he's the founder of the school of rabbis later, his title didn't exist back then. During the period of the Maccabees, which was the 2nd century before the Common Era, they didn't have that title. The titles earlier were things like priest, Kohen, Levi, Levite, right? These were titles. Navi, prophet. We had Melech, king. We had Zaken, elder. But we didn't have rabbi, and we didn't have Rav. Those titles emerged later, after the destruction of the temple, the Second Temple. Then we start to get those titles. Any comments or questions? Okay, so what happened over the years? Well, early on in the Mishnaic period, and even into the Talmud, that's 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th century of the Common Era, right? So the years 200, 300, 400, in those years, rabbis often didn't get paid as rabbis. It was an honorific. They were called rabbis. They were great teachers. They were scholars, but they all had jobs. They didn't earn money teaching. The whole idea of being a rabbi, there were teachers who taught students, but it wasn't always rabbis that did it. In fact, it usually wasn't. It was someone who had knowledge and could teach, but the rabbi usually had their own job. Sometimes they were very poor. One rabbi talks about being a metal fashioner of metal objects, like another one shoed horses. Some of them were wealthy. They had vineyards. Some of them worked in mines, but they were scholars. Well, eventually it became clear that if we wanted to maintain the idea of rabbis, we had to help support them. And so it evolved over time that rabbis became the teachers and were paid for that. They were paid for their opinions. When they were asked a halachic question, they were given money. When they worked at a synagogue to guide the synagogue or to rule on the kosher issues of meat and milk, whether a chicken was kosher or not kosher, they would get paid for all of that. Originally, it was probably piecemeal, and eventually it became salaried over time, but they still weren't well paid. When I became a rabbi in Worcester, the conservative rabbi in the other synagogue in Beth Israel was a Holocaust survivor, a wonderful man, Baruch Goldstein, Alav Shalom. He was just a really sweet, wonderful guy. And I remember that he had asked for a raise when I was there, and they wouldn't give him a raise, but they bought him a new tallis. You know, they treated him terribly. They really did. But that was even then. We're talking about in a conservative synagogue, 1980. You know, they often treated rabbis like schleppers financially. Now, that wasn't necessarily true in the Reform movement, and it wasn't even true in the conservative. I mean, Rabbi Lehrman was certainly not treated that way. You know, rabbis in bigger congregations, bigger communities, you know, many of them were treated well and given good salaries. But it's still, even then, even as late as those days, was still not seen in a professional role to be paid like a doctor or a lawyer. It was more like a teacher. They were paid like a teacher, maybe a principal of a high school, but they weren't seen in any other way. So that evolved over all these generations, that at least we should pay the rabbi, so the rabbi can study and help us know what is kosher and what isn't kosher, what the halacha is, what the halacha isn't. All of that evolved over time. Now, any question about that? Because we're up to the modern era now. Yes, Roger.
Well, that conservative rabbi, did they give him a place to live? And was he leading a prayer service and doing the Torah reading on Saturday? There had to be some sort of compensation.
Oh, no, he had a salary. He was given a salary, but it was like a teacher's salary. He had a place, a parsonage. They owned it. So his rent was paid. And but he also didn't make any equity. You know, he didn't have a pension from the synagogue. By the way, Rabbi Kronish didn't have a pension. When I came to the synagogue, he didn't have a pension put aside. It was part of the discussions we had with him and his family, partly because, not just because he was disabled and he couldn't fulfill his function as a rabbi of the synagogue, but he didn't have a pension. How were he and Lillian going to live? And, you know, they had their house. We didn't own the house. The synagogue didn't own the house, but he still needed to survive, and Social Security wasn't going to do it. So the synagogue itself negotiated a pension, which the synagogue paid every year that he was alive and every year that Lillian was alive, so that they had enough to be able to live in the style that they needed to live with dignity. And I was proud of the synagogue that they came forward, but it was all out of operating, meaning we didn't have a corpus to pay that. It was part of the operating budget, I think. I don't know, Alice, when you came, was it still part of the, certainly was, because of Lillian. And last, you know, because she outlived him by a number of years.
Right. It was a bone of contention it was definitely discussed on the budget committee, and it was a large part of our budget at that time.
Right. Well,
relatively speaking.
Right. And again, here we're talking about a modern synagogue, a thriving synagogue, and a modern period, a rabbi who obviously had virtually, with his own power, shaped the synagogue. With the lay leadership together, they had shaped and built the synagogue, and yet he didn't have a pension to retire on.
But I have a different read on it.
What is it?
I have to read that we were all, the rabbi and the congregation, we were all, our parent, me, my parents, my grandparents, we were learning in this process. We were growing in this process. Right. I remember my grandparents had a little apartment in New Jersey, and the rabbis would come to them and they would be engaged in conversation with my grandparents, and my grandparents gave them a donation. And right. that was the way they were being compensated for at that particular time. And I think that that's the way, you know, Rabbi Kronish's parents were treated. You know, I don't know that his parents were in the clergy, but I mean, I think that that's, you know, his seniors were treated in that kind of way. The Orthodox were treated in that kind of a way. And then they became a part of of a reform congregation or a conservative congregation, and then people, became more affluent, and then they saw what the neighbors were doing in other religions, and they learned, and they
right.
then
No,
took on the
you're right.
responsibility. They
You're
were
right.
becoming American capitalists.
Well, I don't know about
They
that.
ended up, my people ended up Republicans, my God.
Well, no, not yet. But we do have a significant group of American Jewish Republicans, at least 30%, it looks like. Alice.
I was just wondering, when did the Reform Pension Board start?
Right. So the Reform Pension Board really got going in the early 60s. But most of the rabbis, or mid 60s, but most of the rabbis, for one, most of the congregations didn't buy into it. And most of the rabbis didn't buy into it. For one thing, their salaries weren't very large. And so the idea of them putting aside money into a pension just was not part, as Dennis said, it really wasn't the consciousness of that generation or of the congregations. When I became a rabbi, I was told by the CCAR representative, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the Reform Rabbinic Organization, I was told what I should ask for. And when we came out with a minimum package for assistant rabbis. And we said, none of us will come to be assistant rabbis for less than this package. The package at the time was $16,000, and that included pension, it included parsonage, and it included travel to the conference. So that was $16,000. That was minimum, which is what I received at my first congregation. But it had in it that the congregation had to pay 15% into my pension, and I had to pay 3%. And that was the agreement that had been reached. And by the time I was ordained in 1974, it was already agreed in the Reform movement that generally that's how it would be treated. Not every congregation bought into it, but most of them did. And most of my colleagues, when we came out, that's what we got. Right? So if you think about it, that was 1974. And Rabbi Kronish had his stroke in 1984. And he had not become part of the pension system. Most of his colleagues still hadn't yet. Some had, most hadn't, of that generation. What I'm saying is that this was an evolution of the title rabbi in the modern era from being what it had been in the late Middle Ages into a more professional role where we were seen in terms of the community, not just with honor, because Rabbi Kronish was given plenty of honor, right? He was honored as a rabbi. He was honored in the community. He was honored in Israel. He was listened to. He had influence, but he was not professionally treated financially the way lawyers and doctors were treated at that time. When I became a rabbi, we were moving in that direction. It was another level. So rabbis today are seen as professionals, for good or bad, right? Because we have contracts, and the contracts are often very difficult because they are just like you would have a contract with a CEO of a corporation. Our contracts are negotiated that way. That was never the way rabbis were dealt with up until really my generation. It's a modern change. But what I'm saying is this has been a changing process going all the way back to the Mishnah and Talmud. The rabbi was a respected figure, but not seen in the same way that we see rabbis today. And I also have to say, another change that's happened is in Rabbi Kronish's day, he was a much greater influence in the community, Jewishly and non-Jewishly, and politically, than rabbis today are. The rabbi, he was, as was Rabbi Lehrman, the chairman of the emergency campaign for Israel in Federation. That would never happen today. Rabbi does not even sit on the executive committee of Federation, nor has a rabbi sat on the executive committee of Federation since, I believe, since I've been in Miami. And in the earlier days, Rabbi Lehrman sat, Rabbi Kronish sat, Rabbi Neritz sat, Rabbi Baumgart at some point. They were seen as leaders of the community to sit among the wealthy donors and to direct and help direct the community. That changed. We were seen as influencers, but not as sitting in the same seat of power. That was true in Israel as well. Rabbi Kronish was listened to in Israel by the leaders of the movements. The labor Zionist movement listened to Rabbi Kronish. He had access to them. They would talk and they would come and speak. He called them all the time. They took his calls. That doesn't happen today, with the exception of the leaders of the movements. So Rabbi Rick Jacobs can be listened to by leaders in Israel or around the Jewish world. But a rabbi anywhere else has to go through those channels to try and get there. It's who you know. It's like any lay leader. All of these are shifting ways that we see our rabbis over time. And I want to take us to the next piece, which is, what about women? We have a woman senior rabbi. What about when women entered into this role? And I want to take us to the Orthodox statement about how this evolved. And this is really pretty late. This is already in the 1990s that we're talking about this, and the early 2000s. So here is Rabbi Aryeh Clapper, who is an Orthodox rabbi. He's Orthodox like Yeshiva University Orthodox. He's not Haredi. He's not Hasidic. He's modern Orthodox, but he is within the mainstream of Orthodoxy. And this rabbi, Rabbi X, doesn't even have his name, asked the question about, what about women becoming rabbis? And here is the answer. I'm going to just read a little of it. I'm honored by the request you convey and will do my best to convey my opinion. I hope it will be helpful as the Orthodox community ponders these weighty issues. Here, it is necessary and positive for women to be hired as religious professionals in Orthodox communities. Any such role can be defined as clerical. Therefore, I oppose any blanket ban on women playing clerical roles. So let me unpack that for a minute. Clerical doesn't mean secretary here. Clerical means counselor, teacher, a person who can read a text and decipher it for the congregation. It can mean someone who works with women in a spiritual role, spiritual guide. It can mean a person who runs the mikveh and does all the halacha concerning the mikveh. Doesn't necessarily mean clergy, meaning rabbi or chazan. That's where he's going to go with it, but that's what he's saying. There's no reason to deny women the right to work in the synagogue in clerical roles, right? That's where he starts. Okay. So here, it is necessary and positive for Orthodox women to attain smicha level competence and far beyond in Talmud and Halacha. Women who attain such competence must be given titles that attest to their achievement for both practical and ethical reasons. Okay. So what did he do there? So now he's saying, because women play these roles, we have to find a title that is appropriate and gives them the status beyond just teacher that they are entitled to by the role they are fulfilling in the synagogue. Now, what's going on here in his reasoning is he's trying to find a way within the Orthodox framework of giving a woman the title rabbi without calling her rabbi. Right? It's part of the evolution of the position of rabbi. Now, we're not going to go into the whole discussion, but the end result of this one is that they will ordain rabbis and they will call them rabbah or maharat. They come up with titles, but not rabbanit usually, because that's rebbitzin. Though there are some of those as well. So what happens is in modern Orthodoxy in the late 20th century and the early 21st century, rabbi now gets expanded to include women who have the title and may be hired by an Orthodox synagogue, but might not run the minyan. That may not be what they do. They may visit hospitals, they may counsel, they may teach, they may give halachic statements, but they may not necessarily read Torah on Shabbos. That's not necessarily what's going to happen, but it might, depending on the synagogue. And in fact, there are Orthodox synagogues today where there's a mechitza down the middle, and women read Torah on their side, and men read Torah on the men's side. And in fact, the mechitza is a gauze cloth where you can virtually see through it. And they pull back the gauze cloth, when the Torah is put, and it's put right between the two. So the women can see it and the men can see it. That's on the left side, left wing of Orthodoxy. Now, what happened in Reform? Well, obviously it happened a long time before. 1972, the first woman rabbi is ordained. She is called rabbi like all other rabbis. There's no new name given. She is ordained and given a document exactly like my document. Now, that decision had been made many years before, but no one had been willing to push it forward until Rabbi Glick, Dr. Glick, Nelson Glick, who was the president of the college, had talked it through with his professors and made the decision they were going to ordain this first rabbi. But he also told all the professors, you don't have to sign her document. You sign it only if you believe she should be a rabbi. So not all of the professors signed Sally Priesand's document. Now I want you to know, he was clear not just about that, but he also said to the rabbis, the professors, you don't have to sign any of their documents if you don't want to. And in fact, there were professors that did not sign some of my colleagues' documents for all kinds of reasons. So it wasn't just Sally, but it was kind of a permission given to all the professors. They had to sign if their conscience said this is a rabbi. And they didn't sign if they didn't believe it was a person worthy of the title. Any comments or questions?
Oh,
It's such a personal thing that, I mean, I know rabbis that didn't sign smicha because they didn't like the person. They didn't like women in their class. And they were the brightest women. They were the brightest students in the class, but he wouldn't sign their smicha.
Right. That's right. No, and there could be any reason. If the Aramaic professor thought you hadn't learned Aramaic well enough, he might not sign it for that reason. Or if he
That's different. That's different.
No,
that's not a
I understand
personal.
that. But the permission was given in order to not put, because it then played out with gay and lesbian rabbis, the same issue. And it's still now an issue right now. Can a rabbi be ordained who is married to or in a serious relationship with a non-Jew? That's actually being discussed right now. It hasn't been decided. But there are liberal colleges, seminaries that are moving in that and have moved in that direction. But then again, every professor has the right to say, I don't believe someone who professes openly to be gay should be a rabbi, or a woman should be a rabbi, or someone in an interfaith relationship should be a rabbi. And what they are looking at, and I think it's an interesting solution, the rabbis originally said, when they came up with the title, or the whole idea of ordination, that one rabbi ordains one student, one at a time, but there have to be 2 kosher witnesses in addition, not necessarily rabbis. There has to be a Beit Din. So you have to have 3, one of whom is a rabbi, and then you can ordain. You don't need more than that. So for instance, I know in our own community, in one case at least that I know, a rabbi was ordained by 3 Reform rabbis. In Miami, was ordained by 3 Reform rabbis. And that's how the ordination took place. They studied with this rabbi, this student, over a number of years, and then they ordained this student as a rabbi. And that student is functioning as a rabbi in our community. And that is not the only time it's happened. It's happened throughout the generations that rabbis have been ordained by basically one other rabbi. If some of you may remember Rabbi Frank. Remember, he was known because he had his white Rolls Royce and his white robe, and he would do. They used to deride his.
Yeah.
He would do anything for money. He had a shul in his apartment. Anyway, he ordained his son, Loring Frank. If you remember Loring Frank, I don't know if he's still around. I haven't seen him in a long time. But he ordained Loring, and Loring continued the business after his father died. He continued the same shul in the apartment and continued doing what his father did. But Loring was ordained by his father. One day Mark Brannick put up there, one day conversions. He used to advertise that. Again, he was ordained and he was a rabbi. And in America, the government in America doesn't decide who is a rabbi. Basically, anyone can call themselves a rabbi. Anyone. And you have to have someone following you or paying you or whatever or acknowledging it, but you can be a rabbi without credentials. In Israel, it's a little more difficult. The community has a different sensitivity, but the whole title of rabbi has now evolved into all kinds of ways. Now you become a rabbi if you have an online course. Now, some of the online courses are serious. Some of them are less serious. All of this is the evolution of a title that did not exist and that was made up at a certain point in our history in order to designate a religious leader. And I have to say that what makes a rabbi ultimately is whether a community acknowledges that individual and honors that individual as a rabbi. And that's, in my view, the ultimate way that a rabbi is known as a rabbi. Even if the organization of rabbis does not accept the credentials. Now, in some case, for instance, in our community, our Rabbinic Association of Greater Miami accepts people who are in the group as members who are not accepted by national rabbinic groups. But they are accepted in our rabbinical association, they're accepted at our federation, and they're treated as rabbis in our community, even though the CCAR or the conservative movement or the Orthodox movement or the Reconstructionist movement doesn't accept them. Because ultimately, if the community accepts, then that is acceptable, I believe, for the title. Any comments or questions? Yeah, Roger.
I think I've seen it where the heshers, the kosher stamps, people don't accept. Or they'll only accept their own, like the U or the OU, some people don't accept. Or if you have the what's the thing, the invisible thing that you have, the aura.
Eruv,
right?
Yeah.
Some people don't accept an eruv that somebody might make, so they won't carry. So
Right.
there's all sorts of, I don't know how they come up with these decisions. I really don't.
Well, I quoted this in my last class, so I'll quote it again. In Yiddish, the phrase is, every Jew writes their own Shulchan Aruch. Each Jew decides for themselves. That's what it is to be a Jew. And even the Orthodox decide for themselves what they're going to accept, what they're not going to accept, what kashrut symbol they're going to accept, what they're not, what rabbi. And I have to tell you, it depends on what they need. I've told this before, but Beth Israel is right down the street. And we know there are members of Beth Israel, the Orthodox shul down the street, who drive their cars to a couple of blocks away and then walk down past our synagogue and go over there. Well, over the years, I actually did a couple of conversions for women who were married to members of Beth Israel. And my conversion, no one questioned the fact that they went to Beth Israel, and they continued to go to Beth Israel as a couple. And I was the one that did the conversion. And we had a Beit Din at Beth Shalom. Now, why did they come to me? Well, because they didn't keep strict kosher, and their rabbi wasn't going to convert her. So they wanted a conversion to make their feeling that they were kosher. They feel kosher. They feel they're married Jewishly. And then they go to the Orthodox shul. And they feel comfortable there. Every Jew writes their own Shulchan Aruch, Roger. And that's true about the Eruv. And it's true, there's that old joke, the rabbi, a frum rabbi dies, goes to the Olam Haba, and God, he meets God. And God says, so what do you want for dinner? And he says, I get to eat here? He says, yeah, you get to eat. We eat good here. What do you want? And he says, well, what's on the menu? He says, anything you want. And he says, well, who's the mashgiach? God says, I'm the mashgiach. He says, well, I'll have a fruit plate. Sometimes, in a sense, it's funny, but you could imagine a Jew that says, God, maybe. And I also remember a story. This actually happened in Seattle. They had a Bonds dinner. It was a big Bonds dinner for the Orthodox community, and they were bringing in the chief rabbi, the Ashkenazic chief rabbi of Israel. So there were 4 other Orthodox rabbis who had put together this dinner. And the chief rabbi came into Seattle with the Rebbitzin, and she had packed all her like dishes and pots and pans. She cooked his meal, and at the big dinner, the meal that he was eating was her meal. He wouldn't eat the kosher. So the other 4 rabbis brought their meals from home. So everybody else who was there ate the kosher meals that these rabbis said was kosher, but it wasn't kosher enough for any of them. It's a little absurd, wouldn't you say? But it is a little bit of the mishigas of our communities. We each decide what it is we want. And Rabbi Kronish, when he came here, was seen as the established rabbi who was going to create a community, and he did. He forged with a number of lay leaders, he forged a community in Mid Beach, which wasn't Mid Beach at that time. It was North Beach. You all know that because there's North Beach Elementary right across the street. Not Mid Beach Elementary, North Beach Elementary. And he took that small group of Jews, and together with them, he forged this large community that was in some way in relationship, let's say, with Temple Emmanuel as it moved a little further north up to 17th from where it had been down south. And those 2 shuls on the beach were really the main centers of, by and large, Jewish life in the non-Orthodox world. That's where it took place, in between those 2. They didn't want a JCC, so the JCC stumbled along. They represented the Federation. They represented Israel. They represented those communities, those 2 communities that the 2 of them built. And I do want to say, both of them were ordained in the same class by the same rabbi, Stephen S. Wise, in the Jewish Institute of Religion in 1942.
Oh.
And they knew each other in school, and they never got along so well. Their wives got along worse. There was a rivalry. There was a rivalry between them.
Yeah.
It was just the nature of that time. That doesn't mean they didn't work together. They did. They did all kinds of great things together. And the community thrived. But there was a rivalry between the 2 synagogues and between the 2 rabbis and the 2, in a sense, both couples. So this is kind of was done in honor of him. We've been doing it for a few years, just like we do one for Rabbi Jolt. Rabbi Davis does that one. So I thank you all for coming on and honoring his memory. He died in 1996. Wow. He was born in 1917 in February. And so this is around his birthday. And he died around Pesach of 1996. So yes, Dennis, one last thing, what you got?
Well, I think it would be interesting at another point or another kind of a presentation of the rabbi and the rabbinate to sort of trace the power of the rabbi over the course of time and the differentiation of power in the Orthodox tradition and in the Hasidic tradition, and it's the powerfulness of the rabbi in our modernity position, and I just suggest that as an interesting question.
Well, it's a good suggestion, and if I still have a decent memory by next year, I'll try and remember that when we schedule the honoring Rabbi Kronish. So thank you all for coming. I wish you a good Shabbos.
Thank you.
Shabbat shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi.